Let's talk about a number so big it almost feels fake. It's plastered all over the headlines, it's a constant political football, and it's the U.S. national debt. In this explainer, we're going to break down what this number actually means and whether you should really be worried about it.
Look at that, $34 trillion. That's a 3, a 4, and then 12 zeros. It's a number that kind of breaks your brain. But what is it really? Is it as terrifying as it looks on screen? To figure that out, we've got to start with the basics.
So, before we can even begin to wrestle with a number that huge, we have to get on the same page. What exactly is the national debt?
At its heart, it's pretty simple. It's about borrowing. You can think of it just like a household budget. When the federal government spends more money on things like defense, healthcare, and infrastructure than it brings in through taxes, it runs what's called a deficit. And to cover that shortfall, it borrows money by selling treasury bonds. The national debt? Well, that's just the grand total of all of that borrowing added up over the entire history of the country.
Now, that $34 trillion figure it's a real shocker. But here's the thing. On its own, it doesn't tell the whole story. Not even close. To really understand the true scale of the debt, you need to put it in context.
See, economists almost never just look at the raw number. That's for headlines. They use a much smarter tool called the debt-to-GDP ratio. All this does is compare the total debt to the gross domestic product, which is just a fancy way of saying the value of everything the country produces in a year. It's kind of like comparing your credit card balance to your annual salary. It tells you how big your debt is relative to your ability to pay it off.
And right now, the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio is hovering around 125%. Now let that sink in for a second. That means the country's total debt is actually bigger than its entire economic output for one whole year. That figure puts the U.S. right up there with some of the most indebted developed nations on the planet.
Okay, so this leads us to maybe the biggest and, honestly, the most misunderstood question in this whole thing. If the U.S. owes all this money, who does it owe it to? I think the answer is going to surprise you.
Right, so the popular idea, the one you always hear, is that we owe all this money to our rivals, especially China. But is that actually true? Let's peel back the layers and see who's really holding the IOUs.
So here's the first big twist. About a third of the entire national debt is money the government basically owes to itself. Yep, you heard that right. It's called intragovernmental debt. And the single biggest owner is the Social Security Trust Fund. By law, it has to invest its extra cash in something super safe. And what's safer than U.S. government bonds? So it's kind of like moving money from one government pocket to another.
So what about the other 2/3, the public debt? Well, even here, the biggest owners aren't who you probably think. The largest piece of the pie belongs to American investors. We're talking about individuals, your pension fund, U.S. banks, insurance companies, all right here at home. Now, foreign governments are definitely big players. Japan and China are at the top of that list, but they are far from being the majority owners of American debt.
All right, so we know what it is, how big it really is, and who owns it. But that leaves the most important question of all. So what? Why does any of this matter to you, to the economy, or to what happens next?
Well, a really high national debt brings some serious risks to the table. First up, interest payments. More and more of your tax dollars have to go just to pay the interest on the debt, which means less money for things like roads, schools, and science. Second, there's the risk of inflation. If a government gets desperate, it might be tempted to just print more money to pay its bills, which makes every dollar in your wallet worth less. Third, you could have a loss of confidence. If investors here and abroad start to worry that the U.S. can't pay its debts, they'll demand higher interest rates, which just makes the debt grow even faster. And finally, it's a burden we're passing on. This debt has to be paid eventually, and that will likely mean higher taxes or cuts to services for future generations.
And all of this brings us right to the heart of the debate. Is this gigantic number a ticking time bomb, a crushing weight that we're leaving for our kids to deal with? Or is government debt a necessary tool, something you need to manage a modern economy, to get through crises, and to make big investments? That, my friends, is the $34 trillion question.